So I'm always looking for something exciting to shoot, and today I want to talk about shooting waterfalls. Now I always like to shoot a rock or a root or, as I mentioned, a waterfall. And there's a couple of things I've learned over the last year or so. Maybe these tips might be useful for you as well. So let's get right into it. Let's dive right into the water. Now the first thing to realize is you might want to drag the shutter a bit and have the water flowing. I've got an example I'll show you in a minute of the water that's not really dragging the shutter, but I think most people like that dreamy kind of water look, flowing water. And you need to drag the shutter to do that. Now to drag the shutter, so let's say you're going to use a shutter speed of a second. You're going to need a tripod. Now sometimes when I travel, I can't take like a man's tripod. I take a little tabletop one. It's right here, except that's holding my mic. But you know, even a tabletop tripod will be useful because you're going to need a tripod if you're going to be using an exposure like, say, 1 second. So that's the first thing you have to realize. You're going to have to get a tripod. Now, when I'm using my real cameras and I've got all my stuff that I can use, I use a Burlbach tripod, which is a German tripod, wooden. They're probably still available new. It's not a super popular brand in North America, but I think it is over in Europe. And it's a wood tripod. Now, of all the materials, metal, wood, or carbon fiber, I like wood the best. It seems to dampen any vibrations the quickest. So carbon fiber is probably the worst, and metal's not great either. I do have a Getso aluminum tripod. I don't have a carbon fiber one. I never liked them. First off, I find them too light. Well, that's why you buy it. It's lighter. Yeah, but if you're putting like an 8x10 on it, the camera becomes kind of a kite, and you want the weight of the tripod to kind of hold the camera from toppling over a little bit. So if you get a super lightweight tripod, it's not as ideal as everybody seems to think. So I've never really liked the carbon fiber, but I really like the wood, and I use a Burlbach. It's got Getso heads on it, and it seems to work out fantastic when I get to use it. Now, these first couple of shots, though, were done with just a little tabletop tripod, and these are done on 35 mils with the Nikon F3. And this was on a trip to the East Coast, and there was a waterfall there, and I was trying to make a great photo, and I was trying to kind of make it happen, and here's sort of how it worked out for me. Now, I was shooting with FP4. Now, if you can use a slower ISO, the better off you are. Because sometimes with, say, FP4, or let's say you were shooting Tri-X, a very common film, 400 ISO, you might not be able to stop down enough to get the shutter speed long enough. You might end up shooting at a 15th of a second or a 30th of a second. You're not really going to get that total blur effect. That kind of kicks in at 1 second or 2 seconds. So I like to use a slower film. So maybe Delta 100 might be a good start, or even Pan F. But on this particular trip, I was using FP4. So that's 125 ISO. I'm shooting it like at ISO 80. And you're trying to get about a 1 second or longer exposure. Sometimes, now I use filters a lot for the sky, but sometimes even if the sky's not in the photo, I'll leave the filter on the lens just to make the shutter speed longer, because the more blur, the more I like it. So these first shots, the sky was there. I was trying to get a little bit of detail in the sky. This is with a 24 mil lens. It just doesn't really work. There's that hill in the background, and it's not really as effective as I wanted. But I've got that maybe 1 second, 2 second exposure, something like that, and I've got the blur happening. So same lens, this is with the 24 mil lens. I've recomposed, and I've kind of tilted the camera down a bit. Now I've got a bit more of the water in the foreground, that white water, and less of the hill. It's still not as great a photo as I would have loved. So I'm still working the situation. You could go to a waterfall like this and shoot 3 or 4 frames, or you could spend half a day and shoot a whole roll or two. Now, this is a better shot, I think. And I've switched now from the 24 mil lens to the 50 mil lens. So I've got it a little bit tighter. I've kind of cropped out that mountain that was giving me a hassle in the background. I've got no sky. I don't remember, but I probably left the filter on just to get that exposure longer. Now, when you're printing this in the darkroom, there's a couple of things. I did burn it and dodge it a little bit. Now the water, the white water, is almost always going to overexpose and have very little detail in it. It's very difficult to get detail in that white water and keep it white. It tends to go gray and then it looks kind of muddy. So there's a very thin line when you're printing between getting that some detail in that water and having it still white. It's a little bit darker than the paper white, and if you got any darker, I think it would start to look muddy. So it's very critical when you're printing it. Now on this particular shot, I had to burn in that foreground rock a bit. I burned in the water, the white water a bit in the foreground, and I dodged a bit some of those rocks, kind of right in the middle around the rest of the waterfall. I had to dodge those. They were just going so black, no detail. So a bit of a dodge on the rocks and a burn on the rock in the foreground that's in more direct sun, and then burn in a bit on that white as well. So I thought this one worked out okay. Would I print it and put it on my wall? No, I don't think so. I've only got so much wall space. So let's move on from that one. That was shot with the 50mm lens on the Nikon F3 camera, and that is FP4 film. Now, here's a more recent one, and this is shot again with the Nikon F3 with a 50mm lens, and this was this spring before the leaves had kind of come out, and there's a lot of sticks and kind of a lot of distractions, and this is again with the 24mm lens. So I've walked up to this waterfall area, up the trail. I've hauled the big tripod. I've got the dog with me, and I'm getting this with 24mm lens. A lot of sticks, a lot of branches, a lot of distractions. And this is a kind of a traditional print in the sense that I made the exposure. I didn't really have to burn the water in too much, but I burned in the corners a bit to keep the rocks down and get a little more darkness around the corners. I just like to do when I'm in the dark room, I've made my basic exposure, and then I like to do another exposure, just bringing those corners in a little bit, just to bring them darker. That's just how I like it. But that's with the 24mm lens. And then I switched to the 50mm lens. Now this one's quite a bit more successful. I've cut out a lot of the sticks. I don't think I've actually moved the camera. Maybe if I did, I didn't move it much. But I've cut out a bunch of the sticks, and with the 50mm lens, it kind of brings me right into the waterfall. And there's things you have to sort of work and try to keep out when you're doing this. And one thing that you've got to try to keep out are the people in the background. So with this lens, a 50, I've got the waterfall pretty nice. The rocks, I've got enough rocks, and I've got no people in the background. So this one's not too bad. Would I print it bigger? It's acceptable. If I didn't have better, I would certainly print it and put it on my wall. Now, one thing that I hadn't really ever had happen before, when you're shooting waterfalls, like I said, I'm trying to go f16 maybe at 1 second, or maybe f22 at 1 second. But I'm happy to go longer. I'm happy to go 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds, something like that. Now this is the total opposite. So I walked down this trail, and I get to the end of the trail, and there's like a viewing platform where you can view this waterfall. So it's kind of a tourist spot, but at this viewing platform, the trail ends, and you've got to kind of reach your head around some trees to actually see the waterfall. So no opportunity for a tripod here. I probably had a tripod with me, but this is handheld. So this is, instead of shooting at 1 second at f16, this is probably f2 or 2.8 at a 250th of a second. So again, it's not the ideal way to shoot a waterfall. I don't think you don't get that real dreamy kind of water flow. And then what I've done here is I've lightened some of the leaves a little bit and burn the corners in a little bit like I like to. So this is probably a better print. Now, would I make this bigger and hang it on my wall? I would because it was kind of a fun day and great memory. So I would probably print this larger and hang it on my wall. Or I was there with one of my kids, so maybe I would hang it on their wall. Then I don't have to use up my precious wall space, but I still get to make the big print. So this one's again a little bit different because it's not a drag the shutter situation. It's lean over the edge of the cliff and use a 250th of a second. So that's interesting. That's a different way to do it. Now, this one here, this was kind of a local, it's not really a waterfall. It's just moving water and some rapids in that. But this was with Pan F film, which is 50 ISO. And I'm probably shooting it at 20, like ISO 25. So I'm overexposing it as top like I like to. And this is on the Rollei, which has a 135 Rollei lens on it. So I focused on the rock and I've did a couple of different compositions. And I basically dragged the shutter. So I stopped it right down and I bracketed it a bit, but I was like 1 second. I didn't bracket because of the exposure. I bracketed because I wanted to have a different length of time with the exposure. So I already stopped down all the way, but I did like 1 second, 2 second, 4 second. I just like that motion. The rock is solid. The rock is sharp, but the water flowing past it. Now that just to the left of the rock, there's kind of a stick sticking out of the water. When the exposure got really long, that really became distracting because it was moving a bit in the water. So that kind of limited what was acceptable because that stick vibrating and moving created kind of a blur that was a distraction in the long exposures, like say 4 seconds, 8 seconds. But around 1 second, everything seemed to work out pretty good. Tried to keep the whites almost pure white. Probably technically they'd be like, I'm going to say zone 8. And then I've dodged a bit on the rocks in the background just to get a little more detail there and burn the corners like I always do. Now, this one here, this one is interesting. There's people everywhere. So let me tell you about this place. I'm in Guadeloupe with my daughter. We're scuba diving every morning and every afternoon we're walking around. And we go to this waterfall. We went there 2 or 3 times. So we get there, it's packed. You'll see it in a second, but there's people everywhere. And I thought, oh, well, I don't want all these people in my shot. And but across the river, there was another little ripple, just this little ripple that I'm showing you right here. And I used a 135mm lens on Nikon F3 with FP4. And again, I dragged the shutter. I had the little tabletop tripod, so not the big man's tripod. There was no room on this trip to bring big tripod. We had so much dive gear. We had cases of dive gear and underwater housings. Like, we were lucky to bring a film camera, to be honest. Anyways, so this is with a 135 focused on the rock, and the rock has a real sheen to it because it's so wet, and it had just finished raining, which I'll get to again in a second. But this was a cute little waterfall. This was a nice little area, and with the longer lens, you could keep the people out of the background. Now, the real reason that we went to this place is not for that shot. We went there for this pool. So you walk down a trail, say it's a 7 or 10 minute walk, maybe a little bit less, and you come to this pool where the waterfall is flowing into the pool, and it's beautiful, and it's packed. Like, I mean, there are people, they're like bus trip packed. Like, there's bus loads of people swimming in this water hole. So we get there, and my daughter and I were looking around, and we tried a couple things. I think we went back to this place 3 times in the end because it was a great place to go swimming and a great place to cool off. Not that we weren't scuba diving all morning and already freezing, but anyways, we would go there. This was very refreshing and fresh water and a beautiful place to go swimming. But we would get there, and there'd be tourists there. Well, who wants to be around other tourists when you're a tourist yourself? Anyways. So we get there this one time, and as I said, lots of people, and it starts to pour. Now, this is in Guadeloupe. In Guadeloupe, it pours, and then it pours every day for 3 minutes. But the bus load of people all ran back up to the bus. So we get there, and it's packed, and then it starts to pour, and we just stood under a tree, and it stopped. And there was still other people there as well, like not the busload people, but just some other people who are having a swim. But everyone got out of the water when it started to rain and stood under trees. And that allowed you to kind of jump in. Just when it stopped raining, I was able to move into this rock area, slap the little tabletop tripod down, and do a couple of frames without any people in it, because it hadn't totally stopped raining yet, and people hadn't moved back into the waterfall pool. So I got a couple of shots here. Now this one here is the first kind of angle, and you know, you can see the foreground. This is a straight print, but it needs to be burned in a bit. And so I've done that on this second print. I've burned in the foreground and kind of tried to pull a little bit more detail out of those leaves, and then I've burned the corners down. So, which is my typical thing to do, but I have to burn the foreground down on this one. So the second shot of it is probably more successful. And then I just adjusted the camera a little bit, just moved it around slightly, you know, not a big change, but this is probably a more successful shot again. So this is before the people all go back in the pool. There's actually a person on the far right, just outside of the frame. And so again, burn the foreground in quite a bit because it's out from the tree, so it's brighter. And then you've got the waterfall, and that's quite beautiful, you know, flowing, dreamlike water. This would be probably 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, sort of in that exposure time. I'm sure I tried all three of those exposures. Now, was everyone sharp? No, because that little mini tripod's not perfect. You're kind of holding it and bracing it against the rock the best you could, but you know, you're trying to make things work. Focused on the leaves. Let the waterfall flow, burn in the foreground, burn down the corners. So this kind of gives you an idea of some different scenarios. This one I would print and put on the wall and hang it up myself. So I like it. I think it's the most successful out of this series that I'm showing you right now. I've got that dreamlike water flow because the exposure is 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, kind of in there. Now, one thing you have to remember, let's say you're going to shoot at 1/8 of a second. It's probably not going to blur the water enough. But you've got to be careful. You've got to make sure that you're locking the mirror up and you know, holding the camera as steady as you can. Because at 1/8 of a second, when that mirror flips, if you don't lock it up, when that mirror flips, and even a little bit when the shutter moves, there's a slight vibration. Just slight, just for a millisecond. However, at 1/8 of a second, maybe that's a lot of the exposure. Well, at 8 seconds, you know what, the camera is settled down from the mirror flopping, and 8 seconds might turn out to be sharper than 1/8 of a second because you don't have that mirror movement. It's at 8 seconds, the millisecond that the mirror is moving is an irrelevant part of the exposure. Well, at 1/8 of a second, it might be a bigger component of it. So that's just something to keep in mind. But try to lock the mirror up if you can, or some of the cameras you could pre-fire the mirror. So, you know, there was a way, I think it was Pentax, you could just kind of tap the shutter and the mirror would shoot, but it didn't fire the shutter yet. Not a bad idea to use a cable release. You're going to need a tripod. Have as much fun with it as you can. It's great to shoot waterfalls. I've been shooting them for years. I can't wait to get out this fall and shoot a few more. But these are a couple that I got this year, and I think I've actually got something that I'm going to put on the wall. So, hey, there you have it. Enjoy your day.